Yeah, that's the best we can do. Can I leave you from that? Is that okay?
Yeah.
That's unmuted. Those are for the audience. I'll try and get back in time.
Okay, it is 11:40, and we have Professor Michael Hauskeller, who will talk to us about dying as process and experience. This is the first of the three philosophers speaking today. Go ahead, Mike.
Right, thank you very much for the invitation. Can you see the slideshow now? Can you see the slideshow now?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, okay. So to give you a bit of a context for this, I'm not exactly an expert on dying and death. What I have done, what I've been working on in recent years is I've been trying to figure out what makes life meaningful, what are the constituents of a meaningful life. And one issue that often comes up in the discussion is the effect of our mortality and how that might affect our ability to live a meaningful life. So that's why I frequently also had to engage with, well, as I said, the fact that we all have to die and what this means for us. Now, today I suggested as a topic dying as a process and experience because I wanted to distinguish dying, the kind of dying that I was interested in, from a different kind of dying, or rather a different sense of the word dying, the way we use those words. So there are basically two different ways of using the word. And I'm drawing here on a distinction made by the philosopher Fred Feldman in a paper on dying as a process published in 1989. And he distinguished between the word dying in the success sense and dying in the process sense. Now, in the success sense, we use the word when we say that someone died at a particular point in time. For instance, John F. Kennedy died at 1 p.m. on November 22nd, 1963. So we have one particular time that distinguishes life from death. Before that point in time, someone was alive. After that point in time, they were dead. Now, of course, we can argue about when exactly death happens. So we have various criteria for death, various different definitions of death as well. But ultimately, we would all agree that there is a point when someone is actually dead. Now, when we use the word dying in the success sense, we usually use it in the past tense in a simple tense. So-and-so died at a certain point. But we can also use dying in the process sense, and then we usually use the continuous form of the verb and in the present tense. So someone is dying, not a particular moment in time, but rather during a certain period of their lives. Now, what I'm interested here is a process sense of dying. When do we say that we are dying? And now I have a problem with my, yeah, okay. So the question then is, I mean, the end point of the dying process is clear, it is death. So the dying ends when we die in the success sense. But the question is, when does the dying process actually start? And I can already tell you that I won't look at dying as a particular end-of-life phase that the previous two speakers have been talking about. So what is often referred to as active dying. So in my view, or how I want to understand dying, it may start a lot earlier than that. But when exactly does it start? And so there, actually two questions that I want to not exactly try to answer, but at least try to get some more clarity about. And these two questions are, what does it mean for someone to be dying? And how does knowing that one is dying affect our experience? Especially in terms of the way we understand our own mortality, the fact that we have to die, and how we relate to other people and other people to us. So when is someone dying? Well, we might say someone is dying when they're very close to death, but clearly that is not very tenable as a definitional understanding of dying, because when someone, for instance, jumps from the Golden Gate Bridge, and since it's very high, the likelihood that they will die after they've jumped is very, very high. So in a few seconds, once you have done that, you know you will be dead. However, we would probably not want to say that that person is dying. Or when someone is on death row and sentenced to death and they're waiting for their execution, and they know because it's scheduled for the next morning, this is going to happen very soon. Again, the proximity of death doesn't prompt us to call this waiting period a period of dying. On the contrary, what makes executions so horrible is the fact that those people who die are not dying previously to their death, but rather are very much alive. There's a nice story, nice essay by George Orwell, which I always have to think of in that context. It's called A Hanging. Now, Orwell describes there an episode that he witnessed when he was stationed as an imperial police officer in Burma when he was in his early 20s. And what he describes there is how one man who was sentenced to death and was about to be hanged, he was taken out into the yard by guards, and the guards walked him through the yard, and then there was a puddle, and the prisoner stepped aside to avoid that puddle. And for Orwell, this was a kind of revelation. He writes, "It is curious, but till that moment I had never realized what it means to destroy a healthy, conscious man. When I saw the prisoner step aside to avoid the puddle, I saw the mystery, the unspeakable wrongness of cutting a life short when it is in full tide. This man was not dying, he was alive, just as we were alive. All the organs of his body were working, bowels digesting food, skin renewing itself, nails growing, tissues forming, all toiling away its solemn foolery." So we cannot really say that when someone is dying when they're close to death. So it is not an external cause. We are not dying when there's an external cause in play that kills us. Rather, we are dying when it's something inside of us that brings our own death about. So when the death is not caused by an external force, but by our own bodily condition, then we are dying. Or in the words of Ninian Smart, who in a paper published a long time ago in the 1960s on philosophical concepts of death, said, in a person who is dying, the source of dying is within the person rather than outside him. And I think that is very important to understand the difference between dying and a death that comes from outside. Now, common definitions of dying acknowledge this fact that death comes from in by emphasizing the vital functions of an organism, of a living organism, and how those vital functions deteriorate in dying. For instance, a dictionary of clinical psychology, published in 2013 by the American Psychological Association, says that someone is dying if they suffer a progressive and non-reversible loss of vital functions that results in the end of life. Or Fred Feldman, the philosopher that I cited before, mentioned before, writes, an organism is dying if it is engaged in a causal process involving the sequential destruction of its vital properties, a process which, barring interference, will lead to the organism's death. Now, these definitions are very similar and might appear might appear quite plausible. The only difference here is, the only obvious difference is that Feldman allows for someone to be dying who does not actually die in a success sense, because you might be dying and then some cure comes up, becomes available, and then you don't die. Now, you might say, well, in that case, you weren't dying. But according to Feldman, we might still want to say they were dying, but we managed to stop the dying process, which makes perfect sense. Now, if we want to see this as a definition of dying in reversible or non-reversible loss of vital functions that, if not prevented, results in the end of life. This might seem a good definition, but then if you compare this to the definition of aging, you find that this is very similar. Aging is a gradual and progressive decline in cellular tissue structure and function with resultant loss of homeostasis or reserves. Or here's a different definition, again very similar. Aging is a progressive detrimental change in maximal organ function whose ultimate consequence is death. There might be slight differences here, but it seems to me that there are mostly differences in emphasis rather than substance. Now, we have two possibilities here. We can say, well, then dying is very much like aging, or if we want to separate these two, we need to have a different definition of dying, which would exclude aging from being a form of dying. But it is, in fact, difficult to distinguish changes in health from those related to dying, because the two processes are highly related. There are no generally accepted models to describe the process of aging. There's also no agreement on whether there is a dying process or how it should be defined. The relationship of the aging process to the dying process is also unclear. I'm a philosopher. I don't know to what extent it is possible to clearly distinguish the dying and the aging process, but it seems to me that the similarities are quite obvious. And if you had a kind of time-lapse camera and would use it to look, to record the aging process, not so much of the face or the outward appearance of the body, but look at the organs and the cells and how that develops and deteriorates, it would very much look like someone is dying. So in a way, we could say that the difference between aging and dying is just the rate of deterioration. Aging can then be understood as a slow form of dying, and dying as an accelerated form of aging. But what is important for me, what I'm interested in here, is that in both cases, death comes from within, that we are the source of our own dying. And as soon as we realize this, that death is there already as not just an abstract possibility, but something that actively works inside us to bring about our death eventually. As soon as we do that, death is no longer an abstract concept, but it is an active force that pulls us towards it, like the gravitational field of a black hole, except the analogy is not quite appropriate because it's not an outward force. It is we ourselves. So that is a source of our own dying. So when we become aware that we are dying, we become aware of ourselves as a source of our own death. And that changes things. I'm sure many of you recognize this image. It's from an artwork by Damien Hirst. And it was created in 1991 and exhibited, if I remember correctly, in the Saatchi Gallery in 1992. And I went at the time to the Saatchi Gallery to see it. I was 28 at the time. Hirst was a year younger, he was 27. And even though I wasn't very impressed by the artwork itself, what impressed me very much was the title. And if you remember, the title was The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. And that captures, this phrase captures very nicely the fact that even though we all know that we are going to die, we all believe that this is true, it does not really seem true to us. So that knowledge is very much based on the fact that, as far as we know, no one has ever lived longer than, say, 130 years. Everyone who was born more than 130 years ago is dead now. So as far as we know, everyone dies, and that would then also include us. But this is a very abstract kind of knowledge. And the thing is that when we think of ourselves as dying, when we feel ourselves aging and or dying, then this death, the fact that we have to die, is no longer something that we merely believe, but something that finally seems true to us. And I'm here using a distinction made by my Liverpool colleague, Laura Gow, who distinguishes between believing something and what she calls an intellectual seeming, which means that something appears true to me, which is more than just believing. And Laura uses it in a different context, but I think it fits very well to what happens when we finally realize we are dying, and again, that we are then the source of our own death. What was an abstract possibility before now becomes something that seems true. And with that, something changes in our relation to the world at large, but also to other people in it, but also to ourselves. And Norbert Elias, a German British sociologist, has described that very well in a relatively short book called The Loneliness of the Dying, published in 1985. And he there reflects on the epistemological barrier that separates the young and healthy from the old and dying. He writes, most younger people have no basis in their experience for imagining how it feels when muscle tissue gradually hardens and perhaps becomes fatty, when connective tissue multiplies and cell renewal slows down. Now that is the young and healthy looking at the old and sick and not understanding what's really going on and how it is like to be in that situation. But it's also something that affects our relation, the relation of our younger selves to our older selves. When we are young and healthy, we cannot imagine what it's going to be like to one day be old and sick. Elias writes, it is not easy to imagine that one's own body, which is so fresh and often so full of clumsy. One cannot imagine it, and at bottom one does not want to. And this is what Hurst called the physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living, or we might say the physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone who is healthy and young. And Elias, and that explains the title of the book, The Loneliness of the Dying, describes the process of realizing that one is aging or dying as a process of growing detachment from the world. Many people die gradually. He writes, they grow infirm, they age. Again, we have the connection here between dying and aging. Elias doesn't distinguish them so strictly. The last hours are important, of course, but often the parting begins much earlier. Their frailty is often enough to sever the aging from the living. And that is the hardest thing, he writes, a tacit isolation of the aging and dying from the community of the living. And we can easily imagine this to take place once we realize we are dying, whenever that happens. And we might think of ourselves as dying not because of a particular disease that we know we have, but rather because we're aging and we're closing the gap between our present state and the date when we will finally be dead, and we can feel this in ourselves. And when that happens, we might experience that growing detachment, like when we're in a situation, for instance, you have a job and your employer calls you to the office and tells you your contract is going to be terminated at the end of next month, then you're still, in a way, you're still there in the company for the remaining 4 or 6 weeks or whatever it is, but you're not there anymore properly. You're already taking your leave, even though you're still there. And in a similar way, when you think of yourself as dying, you're already on the way out, or think of yourself as on being on the way out, and that affects your relationship to other people. For instance, imagine you find yourself in a situation, you have a cough, the cough doesn't go away, you go to the GP orders a scan, the scan is being done, they find something in your lung, further testing provides a result that you actually have lung cancer, but it's an early stage, they think they can fix it. But after further testing, they also find a lump in your brain. The cancer has spread to your brain. And now you realize that there's very little chance that you will survive longer than the next 5 years. And from that stage onwards, you think of yourselves as someone who is dying. I am dying, you tell yourself. And with that, you're suddenly no longer fully part of the world of the living. Elias writes, the sight of a dying person shakes the defensive fantasies that people are apt to build like a wall against the idea of their own death. Self-love whispers that they are immortal. Too close contact with the dying threatens the wish dream. There's a peculiar embarrassment felt by the living in the presence of dying people, which when noticed by the dying adds to their isolation. So it's a two-way street. The dying separate or detach from the living, but the living also try to detach themselves from the dying. And in that situation, Elias suggests what the dying need most of all is what the living now find hard to give, namely a gesture of undiminished affection. Arthur Frank, in his memoir in which he describes his own encounter with cancer, which he survived, he writes, human suffering becomes bearable when we share it, when we know that someone recognizes our pain, we can let go of it. But that connection to other people, that is hard to get when you think of yourself as dying. I don't know if you know that story. Many people have at least heard of it in the context of death and dying. It seems to me it's one of the greatest stories ever written about the process of dying and how it is for the one who is dying to go through this experience. Leo Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich, written in 1886 or published in 1886, when Tolstoy was 58 years old. He was not old and frail at the time. He was certainly not dying, but death was already very much on his mind. He would live still another 24 years, but the process of dying is at the center of this story. Now, what happens in the story? We hear about Ivan Ilyich, who is a high-ranking civil servant in the Russian Ministry of Justice. He works as a public prosecutor for several years. And then finally, when he's in his mid-40s and lives a very leisurely, convenient, and pleasurable life. But finally, they decide to move to Petersburg so he can take on a new role in the Ministry of Justice. And he wants to show one of the decorators how to hang the curtains properly. And he climbs on a step ladder, falls from the step ladder. Not much seems to have happened. He just bruises his side a bit and he thinks he's perfectly okay. But then eventually he realizes after several weeks the pain that he has in his side is not going away. The symptoms get worse and he feels that something is happening inside his body. And Tolstoy writes here, something terrible, new, and more important than anything before in his life was taking place inside him. So that is his experience, but others don't see it like this. They just don't get it. Always in the same way for everybody alike, he's being treated. When he tries to explain what is happening in him, inside him, and the concerns he has about his health, when he tells that to his wife and his daughter, they are quickly bored by his tedious story. And no one really seems to care. They get on with their lives as if nothing has happened. So it's a very different perspective that Ivan develops than everyone else in the world around him, even those that love him or appear to love him. And the result is he had to live thus all alone on the brink of an abyss with no one who understood or pitied him. So there's this rift between the others and yourself. And then occasionally, I mean, at the beginning, he doesn't realize that he is dying. He just thinks there's something really wrong with me, and he's worried. But eventually, when the symptoms increase and he becomes nauseous occasionally, he loses his appetite. So it's getting worse. He realizes, I am actually dying. And then he reflects on death, and it's a very different kind of thing suddenly. It may happen this moment. There was light and now there's darkness. I was here, now I'm going there. Where? When I'm not, what will there be? There will be nothing. Then where shall I be when I'm no more? Can this be dying? No, I don't want to. So he's trying to keep this realization at bay or away from him. He doesn't want to accept this. That everyone is to die now strikes him as an awful horror because he's now affected himself. And when his wife comes and kisses him, he hates her from the bottom of his soul because she keeps on living. And the abstract idea, as I said earlier, that we all have to die suddenly becomes a concrete reality. Ivan now knows in the depth of his heart that he is dying. The syllogism he had learned, Caius is a man, men are mortal, therefore Caius is mortal, had always seemed to him correct as applied to Caius, but certainly not as applied to himself. That Caius, a man in the abstract, was mortal was perfectly correct, but he was not Caius, not an abstract man, but a creature quite separate from all others. How terrible and how stupid. It can't be true, it can't, but it is. He reflects on the triviality of that incident. He climbs on the step ladder, falls down. If he hadn't done that, he would still be alive, he would not be dying. So it seems completely absurd. There's only one person in the story that he feels understands what is happening to him and sympathizes, empathizes with what's going on, which is the butler's assistant, Gerasim. He does what is necessary, easily, willingly, simply, and with a good nature that touched Ivan Ilyich. So that is what Elias and Arthur Frank emphasized at that kind gesture that is needed and so hard to come by. The awful, terrible act of his dying was, he could see, reduced by those about him to the level of a casual, unpleasant, and almost indecorous incident. And this was done by that very decorum which he had served all his life long. He saw that no one felt for him because no one even wished to grasp his position. And the only exception to this is Gerasim, who unhesitatingly acknowledges both Ivan's state of dying and his own mortality. He's also the only one who pities Ivan the way he longs to be pitied, namely as a sick child is pitied, petted, and comforted. And the doctors are not really any help. He consults various specialists and they can't help him. They can't figure out what is really wrong with him. But more importantly, they don't have that empathy that Ivan really not just expects, really needs. One doctor says to him when he complains about his pain getting worse, he says, yes, you sick people are always like that. And again, we have that rift between the doctor who looks at Ivan's suffering from the third person external perspective, which makes it far less real than it is for Ivan. When he approaches the end, when he's finally in the active phase of dying, Ivan weeps like a child, weeps on account of his helplessness, his terrible loneliness, the cruelty of man, the cruelty of God, and the absence of God. Why hast thou done all this? Why hast thou brought me here? Why dost thou torment me so terribly? He did not expect an answer, and yet wept because there was no answer and could be none. He asked God what he wants from him, then what he wants himself. To live, but how? To live as he lived before, well and pleasantly. But then he begins to wonder whether he did indeed live well. Soon Ivan no longer leaves his sofa, surrounded by people. He feels a loneliness so immense that it could not have been more complete anywhere, either at the bottom of the sea or under the earth. And that brings me finally to the topic of the connection between death and meaning and how we deal with our mortality. Now, the dying process is something that happens while we're still alive. And the crisis of meaning that someone like Ivan clearly experiences here. What did I live my life right? Was it the right way? And how can I make sense of the fact that suddenly now I have to go? And what comes after? So this crisis of meaning is also something that happens while we're still alive. It is part of the process of living, and therefore part of the process of part of the process of dying, and therefore part of the process of living. So the question of meaning here arises when it seems true that we are dying, not if we believe that we're dying, but if it starts to seem true. And the disconnection from the present that Elias emphasizes is very clear here. It has something to do with how the future suddenly becomes unavailable, but that does not only affect our perspective with regard to the future, but also how we relate to the past and how we relate to the present. Gillian Howie, who also used to be in Liverpool, the only female professor of philosophy we've ever had in Liverpool so far, she died of cancer in her 40s. In her last public lecture in 2012, she said, what it, and she already knew at the time that she was going to die, what it, namely a life-limiting illness, does is take your future away. And by taking your future away, it makes it very difficult to live the present, because our present is a negotiation of our present toward the future. And the result of that is an evacuation of meaning, a loss of meaning. We just spend, when we're dying, our time waiting for the end. There's no future ahead. The past becomes irrelevant and the present purely transitional. It's like we are in a tunnel and it's only one direction there, but there's no light at the end of it. Now, what can we do about this? We can, if we find ourselves in that situation, or if someone else that is close to us happens to be in that situation, we can try to maintain and restore the connection that is so endangered in that situation. What helps is often the little things, the pleasures of seeing and touching and smelling. These are important, but also the realization that death is not the end of everything as it might appear to us when we are dying, because life is essentially shared. There's a wonderful little short story by Ray Bradbury called The Leave Taking, which depicts a very different perspective on the process of dying than we find in Tolstoy. There, the character is very happy to leave life, even though she's also happy in life, because she knows that her family is around her and they will also continue to live. So life continues and she feels herself to be part of that life. And that is a possibility, an option that we all have, to see our own existence, our own life to be continued in the lives of others. And finally, another way of restoring connection is to recover the past. And don't worry, I'll be finished in a few minutes. Viktor Frankl, who spent a couple of years in a German concentration camp and later reflected on the experience in the camp in a book which is now usually called Man's Search for Meaning. It originally had a different title. He writes in that book, those things which seem to take meaning away from human life include not only suffering, but dying as well. I never tire of saying that the only really transitory aspects of life are the potentialities. But as soon as they're actualized, they are rendered realities at that very moment. They are saved and delivered into the past, wherein they are rescued and preserved from transitoriness. For in the past, nothing is irretrievably lost, but everything irrevocably stored. And that is a very interesting, very different conception of the past. Normally we would say what is past is gone and we don't have it anymore. But Frankl turns this around and says, actually, the past is the only thing that is certain. We have done this. It cannot be taken away from us. So if we focus on this, what we have done and what cannot be taken away from us, this might provide some remedy for the loss of the future that comes with the realization that one is dying. So in conclusion, the process of dying is a process of increasing detachment from the world of the living. It can be experienced as meaningful not only if it serves a purpose, but also if it provides us with opportunities to discover what connects us to the world, reevaluate the past as not lost but secured, and finally to recover the present and experience life even in its last stages as shared. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So again, let me bring up the chat. So if you have a question online, if you write it in the chat, I will get to you. Otherwise, hands up. And if nobody here has questions, I have many questions.
It's not a question, but I think maybe you will be interested in some I'm from China, and I realized just now that the reason you are able to ask the question, what is dying, is that you, in the language, in the English language, you have the form of gerund form of verb, and we don't have it. For us, the verb die is just a click. So we cannot ask in Chinese what is dying. Yes, this is very interesting, and just kind of share.
Yeah, you're right. It is interesting. I noticed that too because I'm German, and in German you cannot do that either. There's only the one tense of the verb. You don't have the continuous tense or any equivalent of it. You can say it, but you have to use awkward phrasing to convey the meaning. Whereas the English easily distinguishes between the two senses.
I'm going to take this. So you mentioned this kind of internal external distinction where it seems as though the prisoner on death row isn't dying because their death is somehow externally imposed, whereas someone might more plausibly be dying if their death is internally generated. This does not seem plausible to me because this internal external distinction seems to be really problematic. We might you could graphically think of someone as being strangled and not able to escape, and at some point realize that they are dying. Mm-hmm. That seems to be plausible. Equally, we would hopefully be happy to grant that someone who's in the end stages of cancer is dying, but that cancer might be caused by smoking, might be caused by secondhand smoking, it might be caused by industrial pollution or radiation or Marie Curie or whatever. But how would we make this internal external distinction?
Okay. Think, for instance, about the example I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, John F. Kennedy's death, right? At a particular time. But however, he was shot an hour before he was finally declared dead. And if you're shot, you might not be dead immediately. And this obviously is an external force that then causes your death. But you would be dying from the moment there that you're shot until you're finally dead. Now, there is an external factor, but once that external factor has been, how shall I say, taken place or had an effect, something happens in your body. And it is your body. Your body is now in a state that eventually leads to your death. So you cannot be saved anymore. So the thing is, the reason why I wanted to make the distinction is that it means something different for us and how we relate to our own death. If death is seen as something that comes from outside, than if it's seen as something that comes from inside. Because when I'm dying, even though some external factors might have contributed, I smoke, then finally I'm diagnosed with lung cancer. I wasn't dying before, I know there's an external reason for that, but now I am dying. And what happens then is that the body, the state in which my body is now, is no longer reparable. It is now my body that shuts down, that will shut down eventually. It's my body that brings me down. And that is a kind of betrayal. So it's no longer, my body is no longer something that enables me to do the kind of things that I want to do in the world, but rather it's something that is now killing me. It's the enemy. It becomes the enemy when I have cancer. No matter what has caused the cancer to be there in the first place. Once it is there, and once I'm dying because of it, it's part of me.
Thank you. We've also got 2 questions online. So the first one is from Akshaya. Is it also then possible to approach a concrete idea of when dying starts in a retrospective manner in the case of someone who dies by suicide after a prolonged period of mental troubles? Or would it be viewed as a metaphorical usage of the term dying because the whole experience is predominantly contained in the realm of the mind?
That is a good question. I haven't thought about that. I would spontaneously say, well, that is not dying because it's not your body that betrays you, and then what kills you is not what's been happening in your mind, but rather the act of suicide. But of course, you could argue that this is a result of what's been happening in your mind before. So I don't know. I don't know. I don't think there's a factual answer to any of those questions. When the dying starts, it's something also we need to figure out for ourselves when we want to think of when we want to think that the dying process starts. And you might say that as soon as I'm in a state, whether it's mental or physical, that eventually brings about my own death, I've started to die.
Thank you. Yes, Jim.
Thank you. Just interested in your death row patient, or death row patient, that's wrong, prisoner, who you described as not dying, I think. But do they not share a lot of the characteristics psychologically as someone who is dying in terms of death changes? I mean, I don't know. I'm just guessing. This death changes in their mind from an abstract to a concrete concept, and their issues about meaning. Do they not behave more as a dying person than a living person? Or I know the Orwell example goes the other way, but I was just wondering if there's some sort of crossover there.
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's still a different situation because it's a different kind of certainty that is there. You might have not much realistic hope that your death will be prevented, but it is an outside source, and that outside source is in the future. So you're going to die. You know that if no miracle happens, you will be dead. And of course, it might bring the reality of death closer to your mind. But there's always still the hope left that it might not happen because you are healthy. There's no need for you to die. And it seems to me that the need in terms of your body itself is bringing you down, that changes the way you understand your mortality. Because even though if you're certain this is going to happen, or relatively as certain as you can possibly be, it is still something that comes from outside, and therefore it's not necessary. It is preventable. Your death is not in a necessity. It's not something that is itself an integral part of life.
I'm going to go back to online. So there's another question online. I wonder what the implication is for dying suddenly or dying under sedation, as patients do in intensive care, never having the opportunity for meaning, for making meaning.
Well, it depends on whether they never realized in the first place that they were dying, so there's never been a crisis of meaning prompted by the realization that one is dying. Of course, you can die without ever being aware of it, and you can also be dying without being aware of it, and that is a very different kind of thing, because I was talking about the experience of dying, or rather the experience of dying when one is aware that one is dying. So this is a different situation. If you're not aware, if you're sedated, then this doesn't really apply.
Thank you very much. So we're going to try and stay on time, and that's now lunch, but there will be opportunities to ask more questions and more discussion at the Q&A, which comes at the end of the day. So please stay around for that. Otherwise, we will reconvene 1:30 with Guy Schofield on dilemmas and dying, ethical challenges, and end-of-life care. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.